Chapter 4. What is money? In our discussion of credit and liquidity, the identification of saving with investment emerged as the cornerstone of orthodox economic theory, a tenet that Keynes vigorously challenged throughout his career as an economist. It is indeed an odd identification, albeit one that is always true in a certain sense of bookkeeping terms, since saving is always equal to investment in national accounting, on condition that stocks of unsold goods are also recorded as investment. Above all, however, the identification is always true dogmatically. Not only is it entirely impossible to prove it or disprove it, but also, when adopted as a term of reference, it makes it impossible to represent any deviation from the long-term market equilibrium it describes as being contingent and short-term in character, and for that very reason entirely attributable to the failure of economic actors to adapt to market mechanisms. This is the reasoning developed, with no real discussion whatsoever, in the most widely circulated manuals of macroeconomics. The dogmatic effect is clear. On the one hand, the market is structurally a mechanism that efficiently sets the real price of every commodity, including credit. On the other, the imbalances and crises in which the inefficiency of the market actually manifests itself at intervals can always be attributed to external factors that prevent the mechanism from functioning correctly. In short, the market always works well. When something goes wrong, the cause is not the market, but a failure to adapt properly, in the short term, to its long-period laws. In a different context, but one that proves in some respects very similar to the one addressed here, Hannah Arendt observed that the hallmark of every ideology and the basis of its apparent and alluring realism is precisely its adamantine irrefutability, which subsists until the unrealistic foundation of its cast-iron logic is called into question. And it is upon this representation of the short period as the deviation from a long-period equilibrium that the theory, practice and ideology of the market have been built over the last 20 years, in an altogether indistinguishable fashion. The simple fact of casting doubt on the unconditional relevance of the identification of saving and investment, therefore, implies the need to reconsider the entire doctrinaire framework that has supported and at the same time has been supported by the recent development of the financial markets. Nevertheless, our task is not to counter the fetish of a, let's say, reasonably doubtful doctrine by using the totem of an economist, namely Keynes, who would instead be right to court. The Keynesian revival of recent times should indeed be viewed with no less circumspection than what is known as mainstream economics. What we have to do is identify the evidence that Keynes took as the basis of his critique, rather than repeat what his followers may have deduced. Well, the primary evidence prompting his criticism of the identification between saving and investment was not a theory of economic policy, but precisely the fact that money was then regarded as just another commodity, despite both its peculiar nature and the requirements of the economic equilibrium of full employment. We have already outlined the reasons why credit itself, in its nature as a relationship, does not appear to be compatible with its representation exclusively as a commodity, and why the expression credit market proves misleading to say the least. But we must proceed further. At the heart of this doubt lies also, in fact, one as to whether the credit market can be represented as the market of money not spent, and therefore ipso facto saved. What we must realize in the first place is that the idea of monetary saving is nothing obvious and natural, but rather an institutional fact, and indeed one of a markedly ambiguous character. Why is it so clear that the idea of monetary saving can be presented as an obvious element, legitimately serving as a starting point in addressing the question of credit? The answer, if we hold on to the doctrine that we have, however, begun to challenge, is simple. Money can be saved, and its saving can be rewarded with an interest rate set on the market where it is an object of demand and supply, because money itself is a commodity. Money is the very special commodity that represents all the others, and that can be exchanged with each of them, but can also be preserved indefinitely and at no cost. That is, without losing its capacity to be exchanged with every other commodity at a later stage. Money is purchasing power, or rather purchasing potential that can remain indefinitely in the state of potentiality. It is the commodity that can be put aside and kept out of circulation indefinitely, because unlike all other commodities which are perishable and can only be stored at the owner's expense, it has no maintenance cost. The idea of monetary saving implies the idea of money as a commodity, and hence of a money market. All we've done in the previous paragraph is to provide an, as it were, literary reformulation of the definition of money that underpins the whole of mainstream economics. Money is the commodity capable of performing simultaneously the three functions of a measure of value, a means of payment and exchange, and a store of value. The critical discussion of this representation has already been developed in other works, to which the reader is referred. We shall confine ourselves here to summarizing and asking whether the representation really constitutes something self-evident rather than a problem in itself. Is it really necessary that these three functions should be performed at the same time by the same money? At a still more fundamental level, are the three functions all equally essential? In any case, how should they be organized with respect to one another? In order to perform its function and measurement and make possible the immediate comparability of every commodity with any other, which frees the economic system from the bilateral constraints of barter, money does not even need to be physically minted or issued. I can say that a good is worth €5 a unit without having even €1 in my pocket, just as I can exchange 2 units of it directly for a good worth €10 a unit without actually being in possession of euros. Nor does this hold solely for Adam Smith's crude and primitive stages of civilization, as is demonstrated by the fact that an international clearing system can effectively work in the same way. The clearing union planned by Keynes for Bretton Woods envisaged the use of money existing exclusively in the form of a unit of account, namely the bancor, in order to run and finance international commerce. A bookkeeping system and the system of trade in general can, however, register imbalances at the local level that cannot be rectified through compensation or direct exchange of goods. And in still more general terms, as we have seen, economic life cannot do without structural forms of debt, which money as a unit of account can indeed measure, but certainly not pay. If it is in terms of money as a pure unit of account that debts are reckoned, it is instead with the actual money used as a medium of payment and exchange, the money that passes from hand to hand, that debts are paid. And no reasonably organized economy can do without these two functions. But only these two functions prove indispensable. The third function of money as a store of value is definitely not required with the same cogency. Neither trade nor credit necessitates its existence in principle. All that trade requires is money that is spent, in other words, a medium of exchange, and a common yardstick of equivalence so that it can be spent. In its basic form of payment deferral, credit entails a measure with which to specify the debt at the moment when it is incurred, and a means with which to pay it when it falls due. In any case, neither as a measure nor as a means is money required to have a value, still less to retain the same value indefinitely. There is thus no need whatsoever for it to be a commodity. This is what Keynes suggested in his 1923 tract on monetary reform. Quote, It is not easy, it seems, for men to apprehend that their money is a mere intermediary without significance in itself, which flows from one hand to another, is received and is dispensed, and disappears when its work is done from the sum of a nation's wealth. It is not only that there is no need for money to be a commodity in order to do its job. Looking at the same question from another viewpoint, we can also see that neither credit nor exchange requires what acts as a measure to be the same thing as what functions as a means of payment. When I ask for a metre of material, I want a piece of cloth 1 metre long, not a metre made of cloth. The same holds in economics, and indeed to a still greater degree. The money in terms of which a debt is denominated is not necessarily the money in which it must be paid. In order to serve its requisite function as a public tool, money only requires the relationship between the two functions of measure and means to be established publicly and in due time. This is at least what Keynes wrote in the early pages of his treatise on money. Quote, "Perhaps we may elucidate the distinction between money and money of account by saying that the money of account is the description or title, and the money is the thing which answers to the description. Now, if the same thing always answered to the same description, the distinction would have no practical interest. But if the thing can change, whilst the description remains the same, then the distinction can be highly significant. The difference is like that between the King of England, whoever he may be, and King George. A contract to pay 10 years hence a weight of gold equal to the weight of the King of England is not the same as a contract to pay a weight of gold equal to the weight of the individual who is now King George. It is for the state to declare, when the time comes, who the King of England is." Keynes' observations of 1930 regarded the gold standard, which explains his reference to gold and his criticism of the identification of the unit of account with a set amount of the same metal. But the substance of what he said then still holds today, when gold has definitively ceased to be the physical basis of our money. What is, in fact, the consequence of the difference between a unit of money whose ability to pay debts is defined once and for all, independently of all circumstances, and a unit of money whose effective ability to perform this function can and must be deliberately redefined according to circumstances and contingencies? The consequence is that the former alone fully performs the function as a store of value. Only money in which the functions of measure and the medium of exchange are definitively and institutionally combined is, at one and the same time, necessarily and primarily a store of value. Given that there is always a decision, even at the basis of the identification between the unit of account and the means of payment, the stability of a form of money thus constituted coincides with the stability with which it performs the function of a store of value. But let us ask once again, what does the attribution of this third function mean for money and its relationship with credit? And what effects does it have on the first two functions and on their relationship? Let us try to answer the first question with a formula. Money that is not a store of value is money that serves for the payment of debts, whereas money that is a store of value is itself credit. In more formal terms, we could say that, for finance, money is a means in the one case, while in the other it is simultaneously, and above all, indistinguishably a means and also a possible objective, or, as one would have it, an end. If store of value is correctly understood not as a reserve of means of payment, but as the possibility of putting aside a means of exchange with the institutionally guaranteed certainty that it will preserve its value in terms of the unit of account, that the King of England will always weigh the same as King George, to use Keynes' image, then this intertemporal cost-free transferability makes store of value money the absolute form of every asset and instrument of credit. Store of value money is the ultimate risk-free asset. For that very reason, it can become not so much the foundation as the starting point in the two-directional movement peculiar to liquidity, that is, to the unconditional transformability of money into credit, or if you prefer, of money into capital, and vice versa. Such transformability is, however, operative only within a market whose goods of exchange are money and credit in their unconditional convertibility, and whose price of reference is therefore the interest rate. Only when money is a store of value does it begin to become indistinguishable from other assets. Above all, only then is it completely a commodity. From this standpoint, capitalism begins to take shape not as a slightly antiquated synonym for market economy, but as that peculiar form of market economy in which even money is a commodity. This entails a change not only in the meaning of money, which ceases to be a simple means of payment at the service of exchange and lending, but also in the meaning of commodity and market. The second question remains to be dealt with. Does the addition of the function of a store of value leave unchanged the sense of the first two functions and of their relationship? We now have all the evidence required for a negative answer. The function of a means of payment is hindered rather than facilitated by the function of a store of value. When the unconditional savability of money is guaranteed by definition, it is always possible for the circulation of money to be obstructed by another potential use of money, that of holding it indefinitely at no cost. The function of a store of value makes money potentially deflationary. This is what we've seen in recent months, when massive injections of liquidity have had little success in restoring liquidity to markets and in bringing down the interbank rate, simply because the money pumped in by central banks has been put aside by the banking system itself. The function of money as a measure of value is threatened perhaps even more directly. When money is also a store of value, money as a measure of value ceases to be something really different from what it measures. To return to our previous image, it can become difficult to distinguish between a piece of cloth that is 1 meter in length and a meter that is made of cloth, or between intermediation and speculation in non-metaphorical terms. Furthermore, what by definition disappears when money is a store of value is the possibility of determining the relationship between measure and means with a view to the appropriate performance of both functions, and above all to the payment of debts. What appears in place of this relationship is a thing, namely money as a commodity with a price, the interest rate. We have thus reached the end of our circular path, where what we find is a problem dogmatically presented at first as something self-evident, namely the fact that the unconditional savability of money as a store of value constitutes the basis of legitimacy of the loan at an interest, and hence the legitimacy of the current identification of finance with the present money and financial markets. There is indeed nothing at all self-evident about this. Within the present institutional framework, money is what makes it possible for goods to have a price and comparability on the one hand, and something with its own price, namely the interest rate, on the other. But this means that its circulation does not depend solely on its ability to perform the role of a means of exchange and of a payer of debts. That role is constantly threatened by the possibility of money as an asset being transformed into less liquid assets. The function of money as a store of value, and hence essentially as a commodity, makes it impossible to think in concrete terms about any form of relationship between the real economy and the financial economy. And in this sense, it's not at the service of credit. And all of the wholly justified calls for the introduction of new rules will continue to run up against this obstacle until its problematic nature is finally recognized. The only rule to be imposed on money is one enabling it to be money in the proper sense of the term. What we have endeavoured to show can be summed up as follows. Money, properly called by this name, is not a commodity based on the indistinguishability of its first two functions, but an institution designed to determine their relationship with a view to payment. As we shall see, the basic representation of money as a commodity among commodities has influenced the history of financial markets from their birth as markets of liquidity all the way up to the present crisis of liquidity. What we have obtained for the moment through consideration of the nature of money as an institution is the possibility of drawing and putting forward some distinctions which make it possible to bring to a close this initial phenomenological overview. Before that, however, it will be worth stating clearly at what level we see the problematic element of the store of value to be situated. There is a real risk that our observations may be interpreted as a particularly elaborate and abstruse variation on the old moral theme of the condemnation of greed and of ori sacra fames. Our purpose is not to condemn the accumulation of money. Weber's worldly asceticism of the capitalist saver in the name of an asceticism with no qualifying adjectives, or rather with all the adjectives, supportive, alternative, anti-consumerist and so on, that the anti-capitalist alternativism, internal and subordinate to the triumphant capitalism of the last 20 years, has already coined and will continue to coin. What it means to have an adequate relationship with needs, and whether capitalism constitutes a real and humanely practicable answer to the human problem of the relationship with needs, these are the two authentic political questions in all respects. What we are saying about the potential danger of money as a store of value and as a commodity has, however, an exquisitely economic foundation. That the problem is not moral in nature emerges from a simple fact which tends to be overlooked precisely because of its simplicity. There is no need whatsoever for saving to take place in monetary form in order to be economically significant. The fact of making it impossible to save money indefinitely, in other words, the fact of ending its function as a store of value, in no way implies that one intends to make it impossible to save, but rather perhaps that the time has come to ask what saving really means from an economic viewpoint. On the contrary, the institution of money as a store of value makes it possible for saving to be entirely unconnected with concrete goods and to take place rather through the constant and indefinite accumulation of abstract purchasing power, in the precise sense of power independent of the fact of being concretely exerted, so independent as to jeopardize the very possibility of its being exerted. It is the institution of money as liquidity, of which its function as a store of value constitutes one of the fundamental pillars, that makes crises of liquidity possible.